Are you conscious of your addiction? Refuse to be defined by it? Not satisfied with living your life on the surface? Are you drawn to deeper meaning and purpose? And believe that it's possible to grow through your addiction to experience true freedom? Well, welcome home. Share the journey from addiction to freedom with your host, Michael Gregory.
So welcome again to another episode of Addiction to Freedom. And today I have just had a really interesting and insightful conversation with Noah Levine. He's a long-time Buddhist teacher, and also he runs addiction recovery programs. But he's not your usual kind of hippie spiritual teacher. He's come through, from his own journey of addiction as a kind of a punk rocker. He was in and out of jail with and heavy addiction. So he shares his journey, which is very powerful, and where he's come to and his understanding of addiction. We discuss that. We discuss what the solution to addiction and craving looks like. So I really encourage you to give the time to engage in this conversation, this episode. I think you'll find it very, very helpful. And with that, I will allow you to enjoy the conversation. Well, welcome to another episode of Addiction to Freedom. And today, I have to say, I've been really looking forward to this conversation with Noah Levine. He is kind of, in a way, a radical Buddhist teacher, radical in the sense that he really brings a freshness to the teachings, in particular to the way that the teachings of the Buddha are really quite radical and revolutionary, and he kind of exemplifies that. And I guess that kind of presses some people's buttons too, but that just gives us all something to work with. So he's an author. He's written 4 books. They are Dharma, Punx, Against the Stream, Heart of the Revolution, and Refuge Recovery. And he's been really instrumental in founding some organisations that create a lot of benefit, in particular Refuge Recovery, which I think we'll be talking about a little, and Against the Stream, which is a Buddhist community in LA and around the world. So without, I guess we'll get to know a little bit more about Noah as we go along. But with that, I'd just like to say welcome.
Thanks, Michael. Happy to be here.
Yeah, just mentioning to you before we turn the camera on but I'll just share with our listeners that I first became aware of your father through his book, Gradual Awakening, when I was maybe 20. I read that, and it had a really profound impact on not just an intellectual level, on a kind of a deeper level. I really recognised some truth there. And that's how I found you. I didn't know about you because I was actually searching him to see if I could actually interview him somehow. But so you've actually grown up in your younger years in this whole environment. And I'd really love to get to hear more of your story. But before we do that, just so that everyone can get a sense of what your mission and purpose is, and I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your work and what you're doing at the moment.
Thank you. I'm also a big fan of my father, Stephen Levine. And that book in particular was my kind of early Bible guidebook Against the Stream, or Gradual Awakening. I have a copy over here that I got in probably 1988, something like that, when I started my practice, and very dog-eared. So what I'm up to is I have 2 nonprofit organizations. One is called Against the Stream, and that is my meditation center and my meditation retreats that are open to everyone, anyone who's interested to learn about Buddhism, and Buddhism the way that I teach it, as you alluded to, as a revolutionary practice, as an act of rebellion against greed, against hatred, against delusion, against the causes of suffering. And I've been doing that for many years, about 20 years. About 10 years ago, so many people in my community came to me and said, we want to use what you're doing as our addiction recovery process. We want to use
Right.
Buddhism as, for our recovery from addiction. And, for a long time I said, well, you can study Buddhism like I have, you can practice it, but also a lot of the Buddhist community is not going to understand what it's like to be an addict. And maybe not give you the best advice. Also, a lot of the Buddhist communities aren't even practicing abstinence from drugs and alcohol. So, you might even get misled into like, that's okay. We've seen that happen. So I developed a Buddhist recovery program and tested it out in my communities in Los Angeles, and then wrote the book. And that came out, actually, this last week was the 7-year anniversary of the Refuge Recovery book, and founded a nonprofit and started a system of peer-led meetings where people don't need a meditation teacher. Here's the meditation instructions as a script that anyone in the room can read the script that says, read this, pause, 3 minutes of silence, so that it can be a peer-led meditation experience. So every Refuge Recovery meeting is a meditation-based recovery from addiction meeting that utilizes the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path as the program of recovery, as the process of recovery. So I'm fully engaged in running both of those nonprofits and supporting the retreats, Refuge Recovery retreats, Against the Stream retreats, and this network of peer-led refuge meetings, which had been quite large, and there'd been meetings in Australia and meetings in Europe and Thailand and all over North America. And then, kind of post-pandemic, we're not sure where it's at because all of the meetings went away and went online. And on Zoom, we had maybe 70 meetings that made it to Zoom, which was enough because it was sort of every day. There was lots of virtual meetings. And now we're in the process of going back to in person and finding that how we do that, how many online meetings we keep and how many in-person meetings reappear.
So it sounds like anyone anywhere in the world could connect and participate in the Refuge Recovery program.
Yeah, absolutely. Because of, it's one of the wonderful things about technology. I mean, we can have a conversation where I'm in Los Angeles, you're in Australia. Are you in Sydney?
2 hours south of Sydney in a little coastal town. I kind of moved out of Sydney about 9 years ago. So, yeah.
It's so great that we have this medium where we can communicate across the globe. And like for recovery meetings or meditation groups, you can like be live with your teachers or with your communities, even if you're on the other side of the planet, depending on the time difference, kind of figuring it out.
Yeah. It is an absolutely amazing time that we live in. And I'm wondering, because when you were speaking there, I was just wondering if there was a difference between the structure of that program, the Refuge Recovery program, and it sounds kind of AA came to mind, the AA movement. Did you want to draw a distinction there, or for anyone that might be listening?
Well, I'm a big fan of the 12-step model of peer-to-peer support, mutual aid societies, remove the priests, remove the teachers, and just, one addict helping another. I'm a big fan. Has really helped me a lot. The core difference, and there's a lot of similarities between Refuge Recovery and AA or 12-step programs. The core difference is the philosophical views of the 12 steps are theistic. It's all about a higher power. It's all about God as you understand God, whatever your own concept of higher power of God is. It's about human beings being powerless and not having the internal power to end addiction, and only an external source can end addiction from the 12-step perspective. The refuge perspective, the Buddhist perspective is actually much more humanist rather than theist. It's non-theistic humanist perspective that understands actually human beings have the power, the potential, the ability to directly experience freedom from addiction through our own actions, our own efforts, and not just a grace or a blessing or a divine intervention. That actually we can train our minds and practice renunciation and walk a path, Buddhist middle path, that will lead to the end of not only the suffering of addiction, but all kinds of suffering. And so theistic versus non-theistic is a big piece.
Yes. See, I really hear what you're saying there in that interpretation of, let's say, a Christian-based approach where God is a separate power and that humans are in kind of never going to be able, they're weak and never going to be able to, without this divine graceful connection, be able to reach their potential, I guess, but that potential being quite limited. Whereas there are other versions or interpretations of a relationship with divine power that do kind of assume an inherent oneness. And that's the way I interpret what Jesus is on about. So, yeah, I do hear what you're saying, that the AA movement, along with conventional Christianity, can come from that point of view. But, yeah, missing the opportunity of what the Buddhist approach is, being that we are already one, just not realizing it, and therefore self-limiting.
But the rest of the structure, I'm just kind of I grew up in recovery and 12-step and was like, I love this model. I just don't like the philosophy. Buddhism makes more sense to me philosophically. It's given me more of a direct experience, practical, tangible experience. And so I wanted to create a Buddhist model that's based on the 12-step infrastructure, but not philosophy.
Yeah. And the power of community, and like you said, person to person, relational, I think there's something so powerful in that creates benefit and helps. Yeah. So just from a little bit I know about your background, even though your father was let's say quite a famous spiritual teacher in the West, it sounds like you kind of rebelled against that at some point and went your own way before something happened and you're back in your own flavor. And I'm really curious as to about if you could share some of that journey with us, like what happened there?
My parents split up when I was about 2 years old, and my father was very much engaged in meditation practice and working with death and dying and hospice. And I grew up around Ram Dass and Jack Cornfield and these sort of spiritual events and retreats and blessing ceremonies and everything. So it was all modeled for me. And also I was taught, born into a family that believed in reincarnation and that these bodies die, but that's not the end of our existence, or we're not really these bodies, and I had enough suffering and some traumatic experiences that by the time I was 5 years old, I was suicidal and I wanted to start over. And I was told death is not the end, you get to start over. And so I started contemplating killing myself by the time I was 5, thinking like I could just get out. My parents aren't really paying attention. Dad's too busy out teaching meditation. My mom was an addict. And I obviously haven't killed myself, not yet. But I started getting high at like 7 years old. I started smoking my parents' weed and drinking their booze and eating their acid and their mushrooms. And by the time I was in my early teens, I was doing cocaine and heroin and drinking alcoholically and committing crimes and left home and was on the streets. And Dad had a interesting, later when I got sober, at one point I said to my dad, I said, what the hell were you thinking? Like they let me get emancipated when I was 15 and leave home. And I was like, what were you thinking? Like, you knew I was strung out. I had been arrested like a bunch of times already. And he said, my thought was, you were leaving anyways. I could see it in your eyes. And either you could leave with my blessing and we could have a continued connection. Or if I tried to stop you, if I tried to send you to rehab, you would have ran, we would have lost our connection. And he said, so I said, pretty big gamble, to just be like, okay, go for it. So many of my friends died, ended up in prison, ended up killing people. Like, it was a pretty heavy teenage drug addict scene in the early 80s that I was in. And, long story, but what I ended up locked up over and over in juvenile hall. And at the end, I don't know if juvenile hall is the right, same thing, the youth jails, youth prisons. And at some point I realized, well, I'm a drug addict. I'm smoking crack, I'm shooting heroin, I'm drinking every morning, but I don't know how to stop. And even with some sort of like trying to stop, of like, well, I'll just smoke pot, I won't smoke crack, I'll just, all of those things that we try to do when we're addicted, to try to manage it. But I ended up locked up the last time and having many arrests, and feeling that underlying suicidal ideation that I'd always had, and having a long suspended prison sentence, and thinking like, oh, I just got another felony after a suspended felony, and like I'm going to spend my life in prison. And I had a suicide attempt at 17 years old, kind of a pseudo suicide attempt, one of those kind of cry for help in the jail, and woke up in a padded cell in an observation room, suicide watch. And for the first time that I can consciously remember, rather than blaming everyone else for my situation, I took some responsibility. I was like, oh, it's not just the cops, society, the system, my hippie parents, all of the usual blame, blame, blame. I was like, nobody's forcing me to shoot dope and commit crimes. I'm doing this. I'm choosing this.
So that was a moment of realization right there.
That was it was simple. It wasn't like a big bright light. It was just a perspective shift, realization that gave me both a flood of shame. So much easier when you're a victim and you're blaming everyone else to stay ahead of the pain and the shame.
Yes.
But when I took some responsibility, I was like, oh, shit, I did this to myself. And with that willingness came, some inkling of it. Well, if I got myself in this situation, maybe I'm not stuck. Maybe even if I have to do a few years locked up, I can change. And the timing being right, my father on a telephone call said, why don't you try meditation? And he could hear that I was some willingness that was present that hadn't been there before. And he gave me simple mindfulness, Buddhist mindfulness of breath instructions. And I sat in my cell and I started meditating, and had a very simple but also powerful direct experience that I didn't know before, that I could choose to pay attention to my breath and ignore my mind. And almost all of my suffering was in my mind. All of the shame about the past, almost all of the cravings. Now, not all in my mind, because also I'm addicted. So my body is detoxing and craving and sweating and, but paying attention to the breath was a relief for that half a moment of disengaging from the mind, coming back to the body. And it was a revelation. I didn't know I could choose to ignore my mind. I'd been obeying my mind my whole life. My mind said, lie, cheat, and steal, and get high. That's what my mind told me to do. And I was like, yes, sir. So meditation felt like this act of rebellion, of like, nope, I'm not going to obey it anymore. I'm going to rebel against what my mind is telling me to do. And I'm going to just sit here and breathe. And as we sit here and breathe, as I sat there and I saw, oh, wow, those thoughts come and go. Those cravings arise and pass. Those fears are impermanent. This kind of insight into it's all changing. And however powerful that emotion is in the moment, it will dissipate all by itself. So that was the beginning shift for me. And then I was locked up for a few months. I ended up not having to do years. I got kind of lucky through a legal process, and I would meditate in those first couple of years. I would meditate but I was so embarrassed to meditate, Michael. It was not cool in my
Oh,
culture. It was not cool in my generation. I was a punk rock street tough guy. I'm not spiritual. Spiritual is for hippies. It's for religious people. It's not for us. So I didn't have any mirroring in my subculture of that this was a thing to do.
right.
I also started going to 12 step, and in 12 step I met some people that I could relate to that were trying to recover, that were recovering. But as we said before, the philosophy, they're telling me to pray to God. I don't believe in God. They're telling me that I'm powerless, that only a higher power is going to remove these cravings from me. The philosophy is not making sense to me, but the people are cool. And
Right.
I even knew some of the people from the streets that had gotten into recovery. I started going to meditation retreats when I was about 19. I went to Jack Kornfield meditation, silent Buddhist meditation retreat. I asked my dad, I was like, okay, I'm in. What do I do? I'm sober, I'm in. And for those first couple of years, I still had that delusion that there might be an external refuge, an external solution. If I could get money, the car, the girlfriend, the record collection, that stuff would fix. And so then I found myself a couple of years sober with the stuff, with all of the same fears and misery and ego identification that was causing all my suffering. And that's when I said, hey, Dad, I'm meditating a little bit. What do I do next? He said, go to a retreat. I went to a retreat with Cornfield, and I was like, oh, wow, like this is really hard, but this is my only hope. For me, I felt like this makes sense. It's practical. I can experience the impermanent nature when I just sit with it. I can starting to see that my mind was not myself, not who I am.
Right. So this is like, just reflecting on what you've said there, you had some, when you're really young, like 5 or 6, you had some real suffering, and you tried to solve that by getting high and hanging out with people who accepted you. That created more suffering. And then you tried the objects, getting stuff around you, as if changing your environment, as if that's going to create happiness. And you found that didn't work. But you had this, through some insight, that you were creating this suffering for yourself, then started to experience, just sat still and started to experience, your awareness started to experience the truth of some of these layers of how this suffering was being created. And you were still, sounds like you were still quite young, like under 20. I mean, even though you could say some people might label and judge that as good and bad, but I just see the whole thing as fast track, fast track to a real solution, which is starting to understand the truth of how your awareness, like you just said then, that you can observe your so-called self. So starting to become aware of, well, what is that that's observing myself? And ask those questions under 20.
Yeah. And then this huge shift. And I think I attribute a lot of some of it's just being a young, passionate person, but being an addict, you give me anything that gives me a little bit of relief, I'm going to do it over and over and over and over. And I went to the 3-day retreat, and then I went to a 5-day retreat, and then I went to a 10-day retreat, and then I did 10 10-day retreats, and then I did a 30-day retreat, and then I did a 90-day retreat. And I was just like, this is the solution. How do I mainline it?
Yeah. So this was like your addiction to freedom.
Exactly. Addiction to, and just, in my 20s, I was in balance, I was celibate. I took a vow of celibacy. I was vegan, sugar-free, caffeine-free, and also like a bit of an ego trip around enlightenment and that confusion around like, I'm going to get enlightened. And even a competitiveness with it. And I'm going to get enlightened before you are. That sort of 20-something ignorance but passion.
Yes.
And also it also created some conflict over the years between my father and I, because I became Theravadan Buddhist. And I was like, Dad, you're woo woo guru, blah. I became like, I'm more spiritual than you.
Yeah, I'm
You
I'm the
still,
real deal.
you still believe in magic. And eventually that mellowed some over the years. But often us converts, right? Like we kind of get
Yeah,
full
yeah,
on into that kind of convert. But it helped me so much that I heard early on that the Buddha had said, this is a path that leads against the stream. Because I fancied myself a rebel and had been rebelling against what I saw as mainstream ignorance. And then Buddhism being presented as going against greed and hatred and delusion is the path of awakening. I was like, okay, I'm in. This is what I want to do. I've been trying to find the right thing to rebel against my whole life. And it's not just society's ignorance, it's my own ignorance.
yeah.
And, and after a few years, my teachers, Stephen and Cornfield, and I met a Buddhist monk named Ajahn Amaro, who I don't know if you're familiar with Ajahn Amaro. He's a
I'm not.
English monk in the lineage of Ajahn Chah. I did
Are
my
you talking
second.
about? You're talking about Ajahn Brahm?
Ajahn, he's one of Ajahn Brahm's colleagues, in that
Uh-huh.
same lineage. Anyways, I met him early on my second retreat, and he's this bald Western monk, and really inspired me in all of the Ajahn Chah stories, and this monasticism and celibacy really inspired me. And they started to encourage me to teach maybe about 10 years into my practice in my late 20s, early 30s. So I did all the trainings. I did the mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher training with Kabat-Zinn and a teacher named Bob Stahl. And I started working at the Spirit Rock Meditation Center and Jack Cornfield's place in California. And Cornfield said, I want to train you, and empower you as a Dharma teacher. And at the time, I was like already doing stuff, and I was working at San Quentin, teaching meditation in the prison, and I was working for a harm reduction coalition, doing outreach to addicts on the streets and HIV/AIDS education, and I said, okay, well, I'm a junior high school dropout. I didn't have much of an education, but when I got sober, I went back to school. And I got my bachelor's, and I went and got my master's degree in psychology, and then it all became sort of organically through grad school. I decided, I'm going to write my memoir. I'm 30 years old. I'm going to write my memoir about my addiction recovery Buddhist path. And so that
Yes.
first book, Dharma Punx, which kind of started a thing. It started a movement where a whole bunch of people were like, we relate to this. And finally, somebody who's translating Buddhism for Generation X in a way that we can understand it, that we don't get it as much from the baby boomer generation. And then just kind of organically, then Against the Stream and the nonprofits, and then Refuge Recovery. And here we are 33 years later, and I'm still very actively engaged in recovery and in my own meditation practice and my relationship with Ajahn Amaro. And I'm not quite as convinced that I'm going to get enlightened anytime soon, but I've just seen such a radical shift in how I relate to my own mind and body and desires and aversions and relationships and this whole world, like where the suffering in my life has so dramatically decreased that I have total confidence in what I will call the Dharma, right? The kind of the Buddha's Dharma, the awakened truth, and how practical it is when we train our mind to see clearly. And what's it seeing clearly? Just itself.
Yes. So I really want to actually ask go into that, what that is that what freedom is. But before that, I'd love to know if you have a definition of addiction.
The repetitive process of habitually satisfying cravings to avoid change or control the seemingly unbearable conditions of the present moment. Continuing, this process of craving and indulgence provides short term relief, but causes long term harm. It is almost always a source of suffering for both the addict and those who care about the addict.
Yes. So a process of satisfying cravings to avoid whatever discomfort is in the present. So how do you see cravings, the generation of cravings? If it's a process of satisfying cravings, and that's just an endless cycle. So how do you understand the generation of cravings?
Twofold. One is, right, this is the Buddha's second noble truth. Repetitive craving is normal, is experienced by all sentient beings, and it is the cause of all of our unhappiness. First noble truth, suffering. Second noble truth, the cause of suffering is repetitive craving. So the generation of that, the Buddha didn't say that. He didn't say why, but what do I think? I think millions of years of evolutionary survival instinct biology that we're just born into craving organism that wants pleasure and doesn't want pain and doesn't want the pleasure to be impermanent, but it is. So it's repetitively craving because no matter how high you get, it's not going to last.
Yes.
No matter how calm you get, it's not going to last. It's all going to be replaced by a repetitive cycle of more, please.
Yeah, exactly. And usually that's satisfying that craving is really trying to change something with like change something that's not here or get rid of something that is here.
Yeah.
So this constant, endless, like rat on a wheel of trying to get or get rid of, and the busyness of that is in a way suffering in itself.
Well, it's also why the definition is the habitual satisfying of the cravings, not the cravings themselves. Addiction isn't that we have cravings, it's that we are obeying them. Everyone has cravings. But also, I do believe that those of us who become addicted to substances or behaviors, food, sex, spending, gambling, there's something else going on in us that makes the normal human condition of craving more intense. Now, some would say it always has its roots in some sort of trauma in our life, whether that's a big traumatic experience or a developmental attachment interruption with our caregivers, but that something, because not everyone is an alcoholic. There's lots of people, everyone has craving, but there's lots of people that can have a drink or two occasionally and not drink to excess to the point of dependence. But there's something going on in the addict that is increasing that need for control, that need for avoidance. That rat on the wheel is fueled differently in addicts, I believe, than non-addicts. Now, non-addicts have the same kind of suffering, still have the attachment to pleasure and the aversion to pain, but not to the point where we're putting needles in our arms to avoid, or drinking, ourselves to oblivion. So there is some distinction, which I don't feel comfortable saying it's always trauma 100% of the time, but it does seem to be true for most of us.
Right. Yeah. That trauma somehow kicks off an adaptation, perhaps, that leads to, seeking more intense satisfaction of cravings.
What we do in Refuge is the first noble truth, which we say addiction is suffering. We do almost a 30 question investigation, inventory, first truth of suffering inventory, to look at all of the ways that we have suffered, and look at where is there trauma, where has there been abuse, where's there been neglect, where's there been resentments, where's there been fears, what has fueled this addiction. And then in the second truth, the repetitive craving, we do a deeper analysis. There's, I think, 62 inventory questions in Refuge Recovery as part of the first two truths to help the individual really identify the patterns of suffering, the patterns of craving, the root causes and conditions that led to the intensified craving that we experience, and to start the process of letting go and forgiving and healing.
Mm. That sounds really helpful. Yeah. 'Cause it would really bring awareness to what perhaps what's going on in when those cravings and the addictive behavior is occurring. So what would you say then is the solution to this?
Renunciation, abstinence based practice, stop,
So a
and
lot of
stop
people would call that
through.
what a lot of people would say that stopping is the end goal, and they're having trouble even with that, and that's the nature of the addiction. It prevents them from actually making any headway. So
But we stop through, so yes, stop of abstinence through participation in community, a whole bunch of like minded people. We have our meetings, we have our mentors, we have the connections with other people who have done what we're trying to do. If I can
uh-huh.
get sober, you can get sober.
Right. So there's trust and belief.
Mindfulness practice, so that it's not so much faith, and but it's when I bring, just as I did in juvenile hall in 1988, the beginning of Refuge Recovery, start your mindfulness practice, present time awareness, here, now, breath, body, guided meditations daily. And in addition to the wisdom that will come from mindfulness and the intervention with craving, where the more you're disconnecting from your mind, coming back to your breath, that's a intervention with the addictive thought patterns. And then also starting forgiveness practice and compassion practice as a trauma resolution. I forgive myself. I forgive those who hurt me, even if I don't mean it yet. I'm going to start saying it to create those neural pathways of meeting the pain of the past with compassion.
Yes. Yeah, I can really see how so I was going to come to that, the power of love as a real transformative healing, internal and external power experience, and forgiveness being a necessary opening into being able to experience love. Because if we're not able to kind of forgive, then we're really kind of locking in that we're still holding on to resentment, anger, whatever that judgment, blame is. And the forgiveness kind of releases that, doesn't it?
100%. Yeah. Eventually, I like to do the forgiveness meditation by saying, I forgive you as much as I can in this moment. I'm not a big fan of affirmations that aren't in line with the reality of our experience.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's just a mental thing then, otherwise, isn't it? Yeah.
So that it's more aspirational. I'm trying to forgive you. I'm trying to forgive myself. I'm willing. I'm opening the door. And eventually it's like, oh, wow, that actually worked.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, one thing that I do with my clients is I get them to imagine what would it feel like right now if I actually forgave this person or myself or whatever. What would it actually feel like now? Imagine that right now. And when they're able to do that, when I'm able to do that, it literally brings the experience of forgiveness into the present, and kind of fast track takes that intellectual aspiration into an embodied state very quickly. Of course, that's not always able to be done that quickly, but yeah, it's amazing what that can do.
In my early years of trying to practice forgiveness, and that question of what would it feel like, what would it be like to not have this resentment, this, and I can remember of like, oh, I would feel vulnerable. I would feel unsafe. I would
Yes.
feel naked because
Yeah.
I think my anger is protecting me,
Yes.
even though it's destroying my life.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's protecting me. And so that, to become willing to be vulnerable and open and took a while, that courage to say, oh, what if I let go of this and am vulnerable and am willing to be hurt? And that's so radical. That's so like, oh, okay, this isn't about protecting myself and being comfortable. This is about being free. And freedom means learning to be with pain because pain obviously is unavoidable. But the more we develop compassion, the more I learned to care about my own pain and have some mercy towards my own pain, then it was safer and safer to forgive.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's an opening to a recognition that I, who am forgiving, what is that? So maybe you could speak about that.
I like to speak about it in the like, first thing I started to realize in my own practice was okay, everything's impermanent. And because everything's impermanent and my thoughts are arising and passing and my sensations are coming and going and the emotions, even the strong emotions which have this message of like, I'm going to stay forever. It's never true. They arise and they pass. And because of that, and, these are the classic Buddhist descriptions, but they just line up with my experience of that nothing is quite reliable or tangible because everything is impermanent, including the self, including the I, me, mind kind of ego structure that wants to take everything personal. But in meditation, it's so obvious that the mind has a mind of its own, is not obeying, like sit down to meditate and tell your mind to shut up. And your mind says, no, you shut up.
Yeah.
And it helped me so much see like, oh, this isn't personal. My mind is not self. This body is not self. They're just
Yeah.
impermanent processes being known by consciousness, being met with mindful awareness. And so the I on the relative level is just a kind of agreed upon way to communicate without having to believe, without getting creepy and starting to talk about ourselves in the third person.
It makes sense though when some people do that sometimes.
We say, I am, feeling this or that rather than one is having an emotion, Noah is sad.
Yeah.
So starting to just see through it and not take it so personal and developing that discernment of what thoughts and feelings are wise and trustworthy and what thoughts and feelings are confused and not so trustworthy, and making intentional choices based in that wisdom rather than just always believing that it's also personal and that I am my thoughts and feelings and sensations.
Yes. In other words, that there's something that's aware, and I use the word some like thing loosely, something that's aware of the thoughts of I who is wanting this or not wanting that, or, telling the mind to shut up.
Buddhism teaches us that there is not a self that is the owner of all of this.
Mm.
But some of my teachers Ajahn Chah, Ajahn, Thai forest tradition. Ajahn Chah used to say, be the one who knows, right? And kind of an identification with the awareness or the consciousness that knows the impermanent, impersonal, unsatisfactory nature of all things.
Mm, mm,
See through that. And the one who knows is Buddha, the
mm,
awakened, seeing clearly, knowing the true nature of things.
mm, mm.
My sense is that that's as close, with our language, it's as close as we can get to explaining this process. But that in some ways, it feels to me like it's just the mind knowing itself rather than consciousness as this separate identity that knows the mind, just part of the mind being meta awareness of itself.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and the mind not being defined as thoughts, not being defined as separate things, processes that are being observed by a separate mind. Like it's a knowing that is pervasive and infused in what we might call the separate things, the flow of phenomena, at the same time as being aware of that. And that being the only thing, not even a thing, that doesn't change really, that doesn't
The term
need satisfying.
the term in early Buddhism is chitta. Are you familiar with the term chitta? Which is so nice, chitta, because it translates as the heart mind. So it's not just our intellectual, psychological brain, it is our whole being that is both emotional and intellectual wisdom. It's an embodied knowing of what is. That includes the heartfulness. And I like that because that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel like I'm watching from the watchtower of awareness in my brain. It feels like it's the whole body knowing reality.
Yeah, particularly in the aspect that the heart, we can say heart experience of love is one and the same as that knowing in a sense, and whole body reflection.
It feels like the more we clear away the clinging, the reactive tendencies to the craving mind body's process, the more we stop obeying, that what remains is a loving heart. What remains is a compassionate heart. What I talk about recovering something that's always been here. Or maybe we shouldn't even call it recovery, we should call it uncovery.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's
I like-
uncovering this
yes.
loving heart, like that, that's been wounded and has all of our scars and has all of our losses, and but that it's untouched, and it resonates. And also, this is the Buddha's teaching. He said, when I got free from the suffering of greed and hatred and delusion, all that remains, loving kindness and compassion, appreciative joy and equanimity, naturally radiating in all directions to all living beings. And it's like, oh yeah, I want that. That's what I'm going for. That's what I'm trying to uncover and getting some tastes of along the way.
Mm, mm. And I guess we could kind of poetically describe that in another way as freedom, in the sense that there is no craving there. There's nothing to be satisfied. There's nothing lacking there. And nothing can be taken away. So real freedom.
Agree, and or but or and even the fully awakened Buddha said, I'm free and I love everyone. I have compassion for everyone. He said, and my mind continues to crave. I no longer am identified with it as self. I don't obey it. But Mara, the character Mara in Buddhism? Mara is this character that the Buddha is sort of battling with. And it's his own mind on the verge of enlightenment. He's sitting there under the Bodhi tree and he's practicing his mindfulness. And he says, I was attacked by Mara and it was lust. I was attacked by Mara and it was hatred. I was attacked by Mara and it was doubt. And seeing, right, those mind states of craving and aversion and self-centered doubt, fear. And then I kicked Mara's ass. With compassion, with wisdom, with non-identification. I didn't take any of that shit personal, and I was free.
Yes.
But then for the rest of his life of freedom with this open, loving heart, he said, Mara keeps coming back. I'm free, and now every time Mara returns, I say, I see you, Mara. I see that, oh, that's just a craving in the mind. That's just the mind saying, like, ooh, that beer does look kind of good. I see that. That's just a thought.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, I remember how cocaine smells. That's just a thought. That's just Mara arising and passing through the mind with the open heart. And the reason from my perspective, you may have a different one, feel like that's an important clarification, because I feel like so often people think that they're going to get to a place where they no longer have afflictive emotions. That if I'm really loving all of the time, I'll no longer experience fear or craving or aversion, or rather than that's just part of the human condition too. It's going to come and we can meet it with love. We can meet it with wisdom, but don't be so surprised when your mind gives you bad advice. What minds do.
Particularly in this extreme emotion.
Yes.
Yeah. When, it's really strong fight or flight occurs. There's kind of a humility in what you're saying there, because I guess what I'm hearing is that you can't get too, self-assured because that in itself, is falling, really getting identified again with, me being beyond that. And then that's just contradiction in terms.
Yeah, and I feel like it sets people up for either feeling like a failure. I haven't been able to get rid of my nervous system. or becoming a fraud and pretending like they don't experience difficult emotions and that it's just all love and light all of the time.
Yeah, I really hear that we need to be mindful and humble and not lose sight of what's happening right now in our own mind, in our own emotions, not miss the truth of it.
In Refuge, I say, okay, so here we are and we're going to recover. What I want to teach you is I want to teach you how to be uncomfortable. Learn how to sit here and have a loud mind and difficult emotions and an achy back as you meditate. And the better you get at being uncomfortable, the more success you'll have. And it's a hard sell.
Yeah. It's the opposite of, going for, extreme pleasure.
Totally
instantly.
Counter to our instinctual drive towards pleasure.
Yeah.
Against dream, right? This is the Buddha said, hey, you want to get free? Go against your instinctual drives for craving and aversion and learn to be here. Learn to be present and see clearly what's happening. And you will learn to respond appropriately, wisely, but it's totally counter to our survival instinct and our craving tendency.
Yeah.
That having been said, pleasure's fine if we can enjoy it when it's appropriate and without so much attachment, right? Like also there's other confusion around, well, I have to be such a renunciate that I can't masturbate anymore or eat ice cream or whatever it is. And like, no, you can do that mindfully too.
Yeah. I guess if it depends if it's, just again, that cycle of craving and satisfaction or not.
Well, and then what's the difference? And you're interviewing me, but I like to get your perspective on the difference between desire and craving.
I actually think in my world, wanting, desire, craving kind of is all about something that's not here that I want to be here. So there's this preoccupation with an imagined state that isn't present. And I'm having this disturbance about that, that I'm not letting go of. And nothing, and then, I'm not going to be okay until this imagined state is what I'm experiencing. So kind of see them all as the same thing. And I think it's different from that dynamic. I think it's different from where, let's say, the feeling of love, in the very moment of the feeling of love and joy and peace, is an innate pleasure of that. And you could say there's this infinitely momentary desire, which is almost, I'm making this up like a linear thing, but I don't think it is. I think it's instantaneous desire, satisfaction, and reality at the same time. That's the only way I can understand desire different from the wanting model, you know? I don't know if that makes sense to you. I'm curious to what you think.
Well, it does. And I ask because, the Buddhist model is craving causes suffering, and the end of suffering is the end of craving. But I can never quite get my mind around, like, is it really possible for humans to not want, not have, like, especially like our basic, like I want food and water, and I want connection with other people, loving relationships, and like all of those feel like healthy desires, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Different than I want to snort cocaine.
yeah. Well, the way I see wanting food, taking that example, or is that there's a sensation, and so on that level there's a sensation. So the whole machinery of desire can kick into gear, and then we feel suffering, and that's not being here right now, or we can continue to feel the sensation and go and get a drink of water and enjoy walking to get the drink of water and having that drink of water without the machinery of craving kicking in and on the way.
That's the distinction that I want to make for people, is that desire is as a wanting that you can actually not suffer about. You want it, but a little bit take it or leave it. You're not postponing your happiness. You're not suffering about
Hmm.
having to have it. I want dinner, right? I want a loving relationship. I want many healthy things. Craving is the extreme desire, which says, I have to have it. I can't be happy until I get it. And so I feel like it's important because in the Buddhist model, anyways, when we're saying we can end craving, we can end that extreme identification with and belief in and repetitive satisfying of cravings, but we're not going to get rid of the healthy desires.
Yeah, maybe it's a matter of distinction in the sense that what we're calling the healthy desires is, in a sense, a natural phenomena. Whether it be a physical phenomena like feeling of thirst, or let's say an emotional phenomena of, I really miss that person. I'd love to be with them right now. So let's take that one as an example. So I really miss that person. I really want to be with them, but they're not here, and I can't go to them right now. So the machinery of desire could kick into gear and start really going into suffering about, oh no, they're not here, and this is really bad, and and you just, all of that just keeps on repeating, or, and so that'd be the desire. I mean, sorry, the craving part. Or it could be recognizing that that's one possibility of reacting, and the other possibility is actually feeling that love for that person right now and enjoying that as it is, and realizing that actually they are here to the degree that I'm experiencing this love for them. and I don't find, even though within that, obviously, there's a mental thought that I'd like them to be here, but it's no longer, there's no attachment to that, and there's no craving in the sense that I'm constantly in the moment experiencing the love for that person. You know what I mean? The machinery of craving is not participated in.
Yeah, I like that. I feel like it's so important for us to provide realistic ideals and ideas about what people can expect as they go deep into the
Yeah,
investigation of this human process, this human condition. And my experience, the last 30 something years, is that craving has diminished, but desire is still very much present. I want a lot of things and experiences, but I'm pretty take it or leave it most of the time. And it's not like it used to be where I thought I had to have it and I would suffer about not having it.
yeah,
I love that
yeah,
example
yeah.
about missing someone and this
Mm,
mindful ability to be like, oh, I miss them. And it's sadness and actually there's a sweetness to that. And what you're saying, of like this loving, and what a great feeling to feel so connected or attached to somebody that I miss them and I can tend to this myself rather than, so, even if it is a bit unpleasant, that's okay too. There's a sweetness in that unpleasantness.
yeah. It's kind of going into the actual reality of what's present more deeply seems to relieve the mind's, whatever the craving mechanism is that we get caught up in, which is actually a delusion in a way. It's kind of like this part imaginary yearning that our awareness gets kind of trapped into, like this, like those fairy tales where they get trapped in the labyrinth and they can't get out, and then start going mad or something.
I don't see how people do it without mindfulness, without some kind of investigative self-awareness, and whether that's Buddhist
Yeah,
mindfulness or some other kind of inquiry in introspection,
yeah,
because the mind is so reactive, the untrained
yes,
mind.
yes,
But with some meditative training, then it becomes less reactive.
yeah, yeah. And sometimes too, I'm sure that you've experienced this, where sometimes you have such a powerful feeling of love that comes over you that it's like takes over the thinking mind almost, and all those other reactions, and it kind of, and it becomes the dominant reality, which can only ever be present. And sometimes awareness is one and the same as that, but the thinking mind and the thinking self can't wrap itself around that, even though there's a knowing that that is one and the same as me, kind of thing. But not the thinking me. And I, that experience is such a helpful experience. You know,
Absolutely. But I also think that like it takes a maturity, a psychological and an emotional maturity to understand what that experience of love is. And that very
mm,
often people mistake it for an erotic feeling.
yeah,
And, and think that, oh, well, I'm supposed to be having sex with somebody
yeah, yeah,
because
yeah,
I'm having this experience of love.
yeah, yeah.
I had a friend who had this experience early on in their meditation practice. And they said, and I had this big experience and it was all of this love and I didn't know what else to do. So I just masturbated.
Yeah, I know what you mean there, because I was once at this. It was kind of a well-being kind of conference or something, and there were these women from Brahma Kumaris there, and there was a couple of them. They were dressed up as angels, and they were just walking around, and they'd walk up to someone and not say anything, and then hand them a card, right? And I could see this happening, but I was busy doing what I was doing. Anyway, one of them at the end came up to me and And when they came up and looked at me, I was just flooded with this feeling of love, which, and then they handed me the card. And I immediately went, there's some magical connection with this singular individual person. And I took it into that sexual realm in my own head. And then I went to try and find that person, right? And they'd scooted off because they probably knew that men can take it the wrong way. What they were sharing was a divine love. And that was many years ago. I took that to completely the wrong way. I know exactly what you mean by that because I knew nothing different.
And you're a therapist?
Trained as an acupuncturist. I worked as an acupuncturist, but that's kind of morphed into helping people stop smoking. And now I'm kind of extending that toolkit into offering that to people to deal with any kind of craving. So that's where the addiction to freedom comes in. And I haven't actually created that course yet. I'm enjoying these kind of conversations actually. So
I was just thinking about that sort of erotic transference that's so just common with a client in an acupuncture practice or a therapist or a Dharma teacher or of kind of like, oh wow, you're making me experience love. We should sleep together. And it's like, no, that's what this is about at all. Like this is about just experiencing love.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And you're right. It takes a maturity in the understanding of love to discern the difference. Yeah. Well, I'm just kind of mindful of the time that we've spoken here, and I feel like we should bring the conversation to a close. To be honest, really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. So have I. It's been great. It's been great, and I always appreciate an opportunity to connect with a practitioner, somebody who's doing the investigation, and always appreciate the opportunity to talk about Refuge Recovery, which is really, I feel so passionate about this form of recovering from, and I think I said it, but all forms of addictions. We have the substance abuse people, we have the process addiction, and we all meet together and say craving is craving, suffering is suffering. And then there are, women's meetings and food, people who are suffering from food addiction. They have their own meetings and GLBTQI, queer, gay, lesbian meetings where people and most of them are online. So wherever you're tuning in from, you can find this at our Refuge Recovery website. And so I'm just really love getting the opportunity to spread that message.
Yeah, and I love the opportunity to help to spread that as well. So what we're going to do is for anyone listening, we'll put the details of all of how you can connect with Refuge Recovery and other links to Noah's resources, website and books and things. We'll put those in the show notes. And I think with that, I'll say thank you so much, Noah, and I hope to meet again.